April 25, 1945. In the rural outskirts of Torgau, Germany, as spring blossoms dotted the war-torn countryside, 16-year-old Margarete Weber stood at her family's farmhouse window, clutching her mother's hand. The distant rumble of vehicles approaching from the west sent tremors through the floorboards beneath their feet. The Weber family, like many Germans in the final days of the conflict, had been told that American soldiers would bring only destruction and dishonor, especially the African-American troops they had heard whispered about with dread and suspicion. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the untold story of how unexpected human connections across racial and national divides would transform not just individual lives, but challenge the very foundations of post-war German society. The Weber farmhouse stood 2 kilometers outside Torgau, a modest stone structure with a red-tiled roof that had somehow survived the aerial bombardments that had reduced parts of nearby Leipzig to rubble. Friedrich Weber, a former schoolteacher turned farmer after losing his position for refusing to join the party, gathered his family in the main room as the sound of engines grew louder. "Remember what we discussed," Friedrich said quietly to his wife Helene and their 3 children. "No resistance, no provocation. We are simply civilians caught in a conflict not of our making." His voice carried the weariness of a man who had silently opposed a regime he could not fight openly, having lost his brother to a labor camp 3 years earlier for similar resistance. Margarete, their eldest daughter, nodded solemnly while her younger siblings, twins Johann and Emma, aged 12, huddled together on the worn sofa. The family had heard terrible rumors, stories of vengeance, retribution, and worse. The Soviet advance from the east had sent refugees fleeing westward with horrifying accounts. The Americans, they had been told repeatedly through years of propaganda, were no better, especially the colored troops, who German propaganda had portrayed as barely civilized. "Father," Margaret whispered, "should we hide the food stores?" The family had managed to keep a small cellar of preserved vegetables and the last of their smoked meats, precious sustenance in these final desperate months. Friedrich shook his head. "No, hiding things only creates suspicion. We have done nothing wrong, and we will face whatever comes with dignity." The vehicles, 3 olive-drab American trucks and a jeep, rolled to a stop outside their gate. The Weber family watched as soldiers disembarked, their uniforms dusty from the road. What struck Margaret immediately was that among the dozen men, nearly half were black Americans, something she had only heard described in the most negative terms by party officials and propaganda broadcasts. First Lieutenant James Robinson of the 761st Tank Battalion stepped forward, conferring briefly with a white officer before approaching the house. At 25 years old, the college-educated son of a Baptist minister from Pennsylvania, Robinson had joined the army, despite knowing he would face discrimination even while wearing his nation's uniform. His unit, part of the segregated forces, had been primarily assigned to transportation and support duties, but had seen combat as the Allied forces pushed into Germany. "I speak some German," Robinson said to his commanding officer, Captain Daniel Miller. "Let me make the initial contact." Miller nodded his approval. The knock at the door made everyone inside flinch. Friedrich straightened his worn woolen vest and opened it, finding himself face to face with Lieutenant Robinson. "Good afternoon," Robinson said in careful German. "I am Lieutenant James Robinson, United States Army. We need to establish a temporary command post in this area for 24 hours. Your house has been designated for officer quarters. Your family may remain, but we will need to use your main room and 1 bedroom." Friedrich had expected many scenarios: immediate eviction, interrogation, perhaps worse. The polite request, delivered in accented but understandable German, momentarily left him speechless. "Of course," he finally managed, "we will cooperate fully." Within the hour, the Americans had set up communications equipment in the Weber's main room. Maps were spread across the dining table, and radio operators established contact with nearby units. Captain Miller explained through Lieutenant Robinson that the American forces were coordinating with Soviet troops who were expected to reach the Elbe River near Torgau within days. "We'll need meals prepared for the officers," Captain Miller instructed. "We'll provide rations that your family can share as well." He turned to Robinson. "Lieutenant, explain that we're not here to harm civilians. Make that clear." As Robinson translated, Margaret watched him closely from the kitchen doorway. His uniform was pressed despite the long journey, his posture impeccable. When he smiled reassuringly at the twins who stared openly at him, she noticed a gentleness that contradicted everything she had been told to expect. "Mama," Emma whispered too loudly in the small house. "He doesn't look like the pictures in the newspapers." Helene hushed her daughter quickly, embarrassment flushing her cheeks, but Lieutenant Robinson had heard, and his smile only widened. "No, I imagine I don't," he replied in German, causing Emma to giggle nervously at being understood. That evening, as Helene and Margaret prepared a meal combining American rations with their own dwindling supplies, the atmosphere in the house gradually shifted from tense fear to cautious coexistence. Johann, initially terrified, was now sitting near the radio operators, watching in fascination as they worked their equipment. Friedrich was engaged in conversation with Captain Miller, with Robinson translating between them. "The Russians will be here soon," Friedrich said, concern evident in his voice. "We have heard stories from those fleeing the eastern regions." Miller nodded grimly. "That's why we're here. The link-up between our forces is being carefully coordinated. This area will likely remain under American control initially." The relief on Friedrich's face was unmistakable. "Thank God," he whispered, and then looked embarrassed at revealing his preference so openly. Meanwhile, Technical Sergeant William Davis, a former auto mechanic from Detroit, had discovered that the Weber's ancient tractor had stopped running weeks earlier. Without being asked, he began examining it in the small barn adjacent to the house. Margaret brought him water as the afternoon sun beat down, watching curiously as his skilled hands disassembled the carburetor. "Your father hasn't been able to plant properly without this," Davis said, Robinson translating a few yards away. "Criminal. Leaving people without working equipment during planting season, war or no war." Margaret was struck by the concern in his voice, concern for a German family's welfare that seemed entirely genuine. "My father tried to fix it," she explained through Robinson, "but parts are impossible to find now." Davis nodded. "I can improvise something. Not permanent, but it'll get you through planting season." By nightfall, the tractor was running again. Friedrich started it up, listening to the steady rhythm of the engine with tears in his eyes. He attempted to thank Davis in broken English, clasping the man's oil-stained hand in both of his own. The soldiers set up their sleeping arrangements. Officers in the house, enlisted men in tents outside. As Margareta helped distribute blankets, she found herself assigned to assist Lieutenant Robinson with translating various requests from her parents. Their conversations, initially formal and tense, gradually became more natural. "You speak excellent German," Margaret noted as they arranged sleeping quarters. "Did you study our language before the war?" Robinson nodded. "I studied German literature at university. Goethe, Schiller. Man, I never imagined I would use it like this." Margaret's surprise must have shown on her face, because Robinson smiled ruefully. "You didn't expect an American, especially one who looks like me, to have studied German classics." Margaret blushed deeply. "I'm sorry, we were told many things." "As were we," Robinson replied quietly. "That's how war works. Dehumanize the other side. Makes it easier." He paused, then added, "But humans have a way of remaining stubbornly human despite everyone's best efforts." That night, unable to sleep, Margaret heard quiet conversation from the main room where some officers were still working. Slipping out to fetch water, she overheard Captain Miller speaking to Robinson. "Historic moment tomorrow, Lieutenant. First contact with the Russians at the Elbe. Never thought I'd see the day." "Yes, sir," Robinson replied, "though I wonder what happens after. To these people, I mean." "Above our pay grade, Robinson. We secure the area, establish the occupation zones, follow orders. And these families? This one has clearly been anti-Nazi. The father nearly broke down when Davis fixed that tractor. We're not here to save individual Germans, Lieutenant. Remember that." Margaret slipped back to her room, thoughts churning. The Americans were nothing like what years of propaganda had led her to expect. The black soldiers, in particular, treated her family with a respect and humanity that seemed to defy all logic, given how they themselves were treated, something she gathered from overheard conversations among the troops. The next morning brought the arrival of more American units, preparing for the historic link-up with Soviet forces. The small Weber farm had become a temporary hub of activity, with radio operators coordinating positions and officers studying maps. Margaret and her mother were kept busy preparing food and carrying messages between different groups of soldiers. During a rare quiet moment, Margaret found Lieutenant Robinson alone, examining a family photograph on the mantelpiece. "That was taken before the war," she explained, "when my father still taught at the school in town. He was a teacher." Robinson's interest was piqued. Literature and history. He lost his position in 1938. He refused to join the party or teach their version of history. Robinson studied the photograph more carefully. "That took courage." "It cost us everything," Margaret said quietly. "His salary, our home in town, his standing in the community. My uncle, his brother, was sent to a labor camp for similar resistance. He never returned." "I'm sorry," Robinson said, genuine compassion in his voice. "War makes victims of those who resist evil as well as those who embrace it." "Why do you treat us with kindness?" Margaret asked suddenly. "After everything that's happened, everything my country has done." Robinson was silent for a long moment. "Because I refuse to become what I'm fighting against," he finally said, "and because I know what it means to be judged by what you are rather than who you are." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of more vehicles. Among them was a truck carrying members of the 823rd Tank Destroyer Battalion, another segregated unit of black soldiers who had fought their way across France and into Germany. Among them was Corporal Marcus Wilson, a 22-year-old former student from Howard University, whose academic career had been interrupted by the draft. Wilson had a camera, a prized Kodak he had purchased in Paris, and had been documenting the unit's journey through Europe. Officially, he served as a radio operator, but his growing collection of photographs had become valued by his commanding officers as a record of their historic campaign. Wilson was immediately assigned to help coordinate communications for the planned Soviet link-up. As equipment was unloaded, Margaret noticed him photographing the scene, American soldiers working alongside German civilians, the stark contrast of military vehicles against the pastoral farmhouse setting. "You're a photographer?" she asked hesitantly in English, surprising herself with her boldness. Wilson looked up, surprised both at being addressed and at the attempted English. "Yes, miss. Just documenting our journey." His voice was gentle, educated, with a hint of a southern accent. "May I see?" she asked, curiosity overcoming her shyness. Wilson glanced around, then carefully withdrew several photographs from a leather pouch in his pack. "Just don't let the officers see. They think I waste too much film." The images were striking. French children sitting atop an American tank, elderly Germans emerging from cellars after battles, soldiers from Wilson's unit sharing rations with displaced persons. One photograph showed a group of black American soldiers staring at the entrance to a recently liberated labor camp, their expressions a complex mixture of horror and grim vindication. "You capture humanity," Margaret said, struggling to find the right English word. "That's what I'm trying to do," Wilson replied, smiling at her observation. "History will record the big events, the military movements, the political decisions. I want to remember the people caught in between." Later that afternoon, as preparations continued for the historic meeting at the Elbe River, Sergeant Davis continued working on improving the Weber's farm equipment. Johann had become his enthusiastic assistant, handing him tools and absorbing every bit of mechanical knowledge shared. Despite the language barrier, they had developed an effective communication system of gestures, demonstrations, and the few words of English Johann was eagerly learning. "The boy has a natural talent for mechanics," Davis told Friedrich through Robinson's translation. "He understands machines instinctively." Friedrich nodded proudly. Before the war, he was always taking apart clocks and reassembling them. Such opportunities for education are gone now. "They'll come back," Davis assured him. "The war's almost over." As evening approached, news arrived that changed everything. The official meeting with Soviet forces would happen the following day, and most American personnel would be relocating closer to the Elbe for the historic link-up. The Weber farm would remain a communications outpost, but with a skeleton crew. Captain Miller gathered his officers. "Robinson, you'll stay here with a small detachment. Davis, Wilson, and 3 others. Maintain the radio link and keep the area secure. The rest of us move out in 30 minutes for the Elbe position." The departure of most American forces left the farmhouse quieter, though the constant crackle of radio communications continued. That evening, as Helene prepared a modest meal for the remaining soldiers and her family, a different atmosphere settled over the household, less military, more personal. Private First Class Robert Jackson, one of the soldiers remaining behind, produced a harmonica after dinner and began playing a soulful rendition of "Swing Low, Sweet Chariot." The Weber family listened, entranced by the unfamiliar music. "It's a spiritual," Robinson explained, seeing their curiosity. "Songs my ancestors sang during slavery and after, songs of hope and endurance." "It's beautiful," Margarete said softly. "Would you share some German music in return?" Wilson asked, his camera ready to capture this unexpected cultural exchange. Friedrich hesitated, then went to a cabinet and withdrew a carefully wrapped package. Inside was a violin, remarkably preserved despite the years of conflict. "I haven't played since before the war," he said as Robinson translated. The party officials discouraged certain composers. He positioned the instrument under his chin, closed his eyes for a moment, then began to play a haunting melody that filled the small farmhouse. Margaret recognized it immediately, Mendelssohn's Violin Concerto in A minor, a composition by a German composer of Jewish heritage, music that had been effectively banned during the Third Reich. As Friedrich played, his technique returning despite years without practice, Wilson quietly photographed the scene. A German former teacher playing forbidden music for African-American soldiers in the final days of the European conflict. When Friedrich finished, there was a moment of profound silence, then appreciative applause from the soldiers. "Mendelssohn was considered a degenerate composer by the regime," Friedrich explained, his voice tight with emotion. "Playing his music could have brought serious consequences. This is the first time I have played it aloud in over 6 years." Robinson translated this, then added his own observation. "Music they tried to silence, played by people they tried to diminish. There's something powerful in that, sir." The shared musical evening marked a turning point. The barriers of nationality, race, and the recent enmity of war seemed momentarily transcended by this simple human connection. As the evening progressed, more stories were exchanged. The soldiers shared tales of their hometowns, their pre-war lives, and their experiences in a segregated military. The Webers, in turn, cautiously revealed their own experiences under the German regime, the small acts of resistance, the constant fear, the moral compromises required for survival. "We lost contact with our Jewish neighbors in 1938, Helene explained through Robinson's translation. The Kaufmanns had been friends for years. They owned the dress shop in town. One day they were gone, their shop closed. No one would speak of them." "Many Americans don't understand," Robinson said after translating for the others. "They think all Germans were the same, all equally guilty." "And many Germans were taught that all Americans are the same," Margaret responded, looking pointedly at the black soldiers. Clearly, that was a lie as well. The following morning brought news of the official meeting between American and Soviet forces at the Elbe River. The historic handshake had occurred, photographs were taken, and the long-awaited link-up of Eastern and Western allies had finally happened. The war in Europe was effectively over, though the formal surrender was still days away. As this news came through the radio, a truck arrived with supplies and mail for the American soldiers. Among the items was a copy of Stars and Stripes, the military newspaper, with dramatic photographs of the Elbe meeting. Wilson examined it eagerly. "History happening just kilometers from here," he said, showing the newspaper to the others. "And look, they've got Negro soldiers in some of these photos. Usually they edit us out." The mail delivery also brought personal letters. Sergeant Davis received several from his wife in Detroit, which he read privately before sharing a photograph with the Weber family. Davis in his uniform standing proudly beside a beautiful young woman and a smiling toddler. "My son will be 5 next month," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I've been gone since he was 3. The human cost of the war on all sides hung heavily in the air after this reminder of interrupted lives and separated families. Even as they processed this, however, the radio crackled with new information. Soviet units were approaching the area, and the American detachment at the Weber farm was instructed to prepare for a brief visit from Russian officers establishing local control boundaries. The news brought immediate tension. Friedrich's face drained of color. "The Russians," he whispered. "We have heard terrible stories from the Eastern Territories." Robinson noted the fear. "We'll be here during their visit," he assured the family. "This is a formal military meeting, not an occupation change. This area will remain under American control for now." The Soviet delegation arrived 2 hours later, 3 staff cars carrying officers and translators. The senior officer, Major Dmitry Petrov, was a hard-faced man with multiple decorations who had fought from Stalingrad to Berlin. His interpreter, Junior Lieutenant Sokolov, spoke excellent German and passable English. The contrast between the American and Soviet approaches was immediately apparent. Where the Americans had established a professional but relatively relaxed presence, the Soviet officers conducted themselves with rigid formality and barely concealed suspicion toward the German family. Major Petrov inspected the farm buildings as if searching for hidden threats, his hand never far from his sidearm. Lieutenant Robinson, following protocol, introduced Friedrich as the property owner. Petrov looked the German man up and down coldly. "Ask him if he was a party member," Petrov instructed his interpreter. When Friedrich firmly stated he had refused party membership and lost his teaching position as a result, Petrov seemed skeptical. Many Germans suddenly discover their anti-fascism now that the Reich is defeated, he commented sardonically. The meeting continued in the main room with maps spread out establishing temporary boundaries between American and Soviet-controlled areas. Throughout the discussion, Petrov made several remarks about the unusual composition of the American detachment, clearly surprised to see black officers in positions of authority. "I was not aware the American army was so integrated," he commented to Robinson through his interpreter. "There are over 1 million Negro troops serving in our armed forces," Robinson replied evenly. "We fight the same enemy." "Yet I understand they do not enjoy equal rights in your country," Petrov pressed, a calculating look in his eyes. "Segregation, discrimination, not unlike how fascists categorize people." Robinson's jaw tightened momentarily, but his response was measured. "We're working to perfect our democracy, Major. The contradiction isn't lost on us. Many of us fight with the hope of returning to a better America than the one we left." The Soviet officer seemed momentarily taken aback by the candid answer. The conversation returned to military matters, but Margarete, helping serve coffee to the officers, noticed Petrov studying the interaction between the American soldiers and her family with intense curiosity. When the Soviet delegation departed after finalizing the jurisdictional agreements, Friedrich visibly slumped in relief. "They will return," he said quietly, "and not as visitors next time. This farm will likely remain in the American occupation zone," Robinson assured him, though his voice lacked complete conviction. The final occupation boundaries were still being determined at levels far above their authority. That evening, as life on the farm settled into what was becoming a strangely comfortable routine, Corporal Wilson set up a portable darkroom in an unused storage room, developing some of the photographs he had taken. Margaret watched in fascination as images emerged on blank paper, submerged in chemical baths. "It's like magic," she commented, peering over his shoulder at a photograph of her father playing the violin, the American soldiers listening intently around him. "Not magic, just chemistry and light," Wilson replied, though he smiled at her wonder. "Photography is about capturing truth, a moment that can't be denied later." "What truth are you capturing here?" she asked, gesturing to the images of Americans and Germans together. Wilson considered the question seriously. "That humanity persists, even through the worst we do to each other. That's what I want people to remember. when they look back at this time. As they worked together hanging photographs to dry, Wilson shared more about his pre-war life, his studies in journalism, his hopes to become a professional photographer, documenting the changing American experience for Negro publications like The Crisis or The Chicago Defender. "The war interrupted everything," and he explained, "but I'm still collecting images, still telling stories, maybe more important stories than I would have found back home." Margaret, in turn, spoke of her own interrupted education, her love of literature, and her uncertain future in a defeated Germany. The easy conversation between them felt remarkable, given all that should have divided them: nationality, language, race, and the fresh wounds of war. Yet in the quiet of the improvised darkroom, those barriers seemed less substantial than the simple human connection of two young people sharing their hopes and fears. Outside, Lieutenant Robinson and Friedrich Weber had fallen into a discussion about literature, discovering a shared passion for Goethe. Despite the complexities of translation and their different perspectives, they found common ground in their appreciation for humanist ideals that transcended national boundaries. "None are more hopelessly enslaved than those who falsely believe they are free," Friedrich quoted in German, a passage from Goethe's Elective Affinities. Robinson nodded in recognition. "We have learned this lesson painfully in America as well," he replied. "Freedom is not simply the absence of chains." Their philosophical discussion was interrupted by the return of Captain Miller, who had been at the Elba meeting. He brought news that would change everything for the Weber family. "New orders," he announced. "This area has been designated as part of the Soviet occupation zone in the final agreement. American forces will withdraw within 72 hours. The news fell like a physical blow. Friedrich grasped the back of a chair for support, while Helene let out a small, involuntary cry of dismay. The family's worst fears were being realized. "Captain," Robinson began, "this family has legitimate concerns about Soviet occupation. The father was anti-Nazi, lost his position." "I'm aware." "Lieutenant," Miller interrupted, "but the decisions have been made at levels far above us. The lines are drawn. We follow orders." After Miller departed to continue notification of other American units in the area, Robinson found himself facing the devastated Weber family. "What can we do?" Friedrich asked, his voice hollow. "We have heard what happened in the Eastern Territories. My opposition to the party will mean nothing to them." Robinson struggled to find words of comfort that wouldn't be empty promises. "I'll speak with Captain Miller about your specific situation. There may be options for families with clear anti-Nazi credentials." But even as he said it, Robinson knew the reality. Millions of Germans would find themselves under Soviet control, and the Americans had neither the capacity nor, in many cases, the political will to differentiate between those who had supported the Nazi regime and those who had quietly opposed it. That night, as the Weber family faced the prospect of life under Soviet occupation, and the American soldiers contemplated their own return to a segregated homeland that would deny them many of the freedoms they had fought to defend abroad, an unspoken question hung in the air. After surviving years of conflict, what kind of peace awaited them all? In the darkened farmhouse, Margareta found herself unable to sleep. Through her window, she could see Corporal Wilson sitting alone by the dying embers of a small fire, writing in a journal by flashlight. The tense set of his shoulders spoke of his own uncertainties about the future. The sound of Lieutenant Robinson and Sergeant Davis, in quiet, intense conversation, drifted through the night air. They were discussing options, possibilities, ethical obligations versus military orders. Their hushed voices carried the weight of men trying to reconcile their duty as soldiers with their moral responsibilities as human beings. Friedrich and Helene, too, were awake, speaking in whispers about what might lie ahead, whether to flee westward before the American withdrawal, whether such a journey was even possible with 3 children and few resources, whether the rumors about Soviet occupation were exaggerated or, more terrifyingly, understated. As the first hints of dawn touched the eastern horizon, none of those gathered at the small German farmhouse had found answers to the questions that plagued them. But in the complex web of connections they had formed across the divides of nationality and race, something unexpected had emerged, a recognition of shared humanity that would ultimately prove more enduring than the artificial boundaries being drawn by distant powers across the map of a shattered continent. April 28, 1945. As dawn broke over the Weber farm, the atmosphere was heavy with the weight of decisions yet to be made. Margaret found Lieutenant Robinson alone on the porch, studying a map with intense concentration. Dark circles under his eyes suggested he had slept little, if at all. "Is there any news?" she asked, wrapping her sweater tightly around herself against the morning chill. Robinson folded the map carefully before answering. "Captain Miller is meeting with other American officers this morning. They're discussing the transition plans for this region." He hesitated before adding, "I've submitted a formal request regarding your family's situation, emphasizing your father's anti-Nazi history. Do you think it will make any difference?" Her voice held little hope. "Honestly, I don't know. These decisions are being made far above our level." Robinson gazed across the fields, where the first hint of new crops was beginning to emerge, thanks to Sergeant Davis's repair of the tractor. "But I promise you this, we won't simply leave without ensuring your family has options." Inside the farmhouse, Friedrich and Helene were engaged in an intense discussion about their future. Their voices, though hushed to avoid waking the twins, carried the unmistakable edge of fear. "We could try to reach my cousin in Stuttgart," Helene suggested. "That area will be under American control." Friedrich shook his head wearily. "With what transportation? And the roads are chaotic. Refugees, military checkpoints. The children would be at risk. And staying here under Russian control isn't risky." Helene's voice rose slightly before she caught herself. "Friedrich, you know what we've heard from those who fled the Eastern Territories." "Not all of it can be true," he said, though his tone lacked conviction. "And not all Soviet officers will be the same. Just as not all American soldiers are the same." Helene gestured toward the door, beyond which the African-American soldiers were already beginning their daily duties. "Would you have believed a week ago that they would be the ones to treat us with such humanity?" Friedrich had no answer for this. The past days had shattered too many certainties for easy responses. Outside, Sergeant Davis was showing Johann how to properly maintain the tractor engine, continuing the mechanical education that had begun days earlier. Despite the language barrier, the two had developed an effective communication system combining gestures, diagrams scratched in the dirt, and the few English words Johann was eagerly absorbing. "Oil," Johann said proudly, holding up the correct container. "That's right, oil," Davis confirmed with a smile. "You're a quick learner, kid." Nearby, Emma was helping Private Jackson organize supplies, her initial fear of the black soldiers now transformed into shy fascination. Jackson had shown her photographs of his younger sisters back in Georgia, creating an unexpected connection between the German child and the American soldier. "My sisters would like you," Jackson told her through Robinson's translation the previous evening. "They're always asking questions too." By mid-morning, Corporal Wilson had set up his camera to capture a group photograph, the Weber family and the American soldiers together in front of the farmhouse. It was Friedrich who had requested this, to the surprise of everyone. "When this is over, when years have passed," he explained, "I want evidence that in the worst of times humanity can still prevail. I want my children to remember this." The photograph required careful positioning due to the height differences between the adults and children. Wilson arranged them thoughtfully, Friedrich and Helene seated in the center with the twins standing beside them, Margaret standing between Lieutenant Robinson and Sergeant Davis, with Captain Miller and the other soldiers forming a row behind. "Everyone say peace," Wilson called out from behind his camera. "Frieden," echoed the Weber family. "Peace," responded the American soldiers. The camera's shutter clicked, preserving the moment. A German family and their American Liberators, unified briefly against the backdrop of a world still reeling from 6 years of devastating conflict. As Wilson packed away his camera, Captain Miller received a radio call that brought him hurrying back to the group, his expression grave. "New intelligence," he announced to his men. "Soviet advance units are moving faster than expected. They'll reach this sector by tomorrow morning, not in 72 hours as initially reported." The news sent a visible shudder through the Weber family, less than 24 hours remaining before the handover to Soviet control. "Captain," Robinson began, About the Weber family situation? I've already discussed it with headquarters, Lieutenant, Miller interrupted. Given Friedrich Weber's documented opposition to the Nazi regime and the potential risks under Soviet occupation, they've authorized transport assistance if the family chooses to relocate to the American zone. Friedrich's eyes widened. This is possible? It's not standard procedure, Miller clarified, but we have discretion in special cases. Your history as an educator who lost his position for refusing to join the party qualifies. You would be classified as displaced persons rather than refugees, which simplifies the paperwork. Hope flickered across Friedrich's face, only to dim almost immediately. But our home, our land, everything we have left is here. A difficult choice, Miller acknowledged, but one you need to make quickly. We can provide transport to Frankfurt tomorrow at 0600. That's all I can offer. As Miller stepped away to continue preparations for the American withdrawal, the Weber family gathered in their kitchen for what would be the most momentous decision of their lives. Stay in their home under Soviet occupation, with all the uncertainties that entailed, or leave everything behind for the American zone, with nothing but what they could carry. What do we really have here? Helene asked quietly. A farm we can barely maintain, memories of better times. In the American zone, perhaps the children will have opportunities. It's not just about opportunities, Friedrich responded, rubbing his temples. It's about identity. This land has been in my family for generations. Land means nothing if we aren't safe, Helene countered. Her eyes drifted to the window, through which she could see Margaret deep in conversation with Corporal Wilson as they hung laundry together. And perhaps our children's future lies in a different direction than we had imagined. Friedrich followed her gaze, noting the easy companionship that had developed between their daughter and the young American soldier. Something unspoken passed between husband and wife, an acknowledgement that the world was changing in ways they could never have foreseen, and that perhaps their children would navigate paths they themselves could never have considered. We should ask the children, Friedrich finally said. This decision affects their future more than ours. When Johann and Emma were called in from their activities with the soldiers, the family council became complete. Friedrich explained the situation as clearly as he could, presenting both options without revealing his own preference. Johann spoke first with the directness of youth. I want to go where Sergeant Davis showed me, Detroit. He says they build automobiles there. Emma nodded vigorously. I want to see America too. Private Jackson said they have ice cream every day. Friedrich smiled sadly at their innocent understanding of what such a journey would truly mean. We wouldn't be going to America, only to the American zone of Germany, and it would mean leaving our home perhaps forever. But we would be safe, Emma asked, her young face suddenly serious. Safer, yes, Helene answered, stroking her daughter's hair. All eyes turned to Margaret, who had remained silent throughout the discussion. At 19, she understood better than her siblings the full implications of either choice. I think we should go, she said finally, not because of fear, but because of hope. What future do we have here? Really? The past is gone. We need to look forward. Friedrich studied his eldest daughter's face, seeing in it a determination and clarity that moved him deeply. When had his little girl become this young woman with such certainty in her eyes? Then it's decided, he said quietly. We will leave tomorrow with the Americans. The decision made, practical preparations began immediately. Each family member could bring only what they could carry: clothing, essential personal items, a few precious mementos. Helene and Margaret began sorting through their possessions, making impossible choices about what to take and what to leave behind. In the barn, Friedrich stood alone, running his hand along the repaired tractor that would now benefit whoever took over their land. Sergeant Davis found him there, his expression understanding without needing translation. Hard to leave it all, Davis said simply. Friedrich nodded. My father taught me to work this land. I expected to teach my son the same. Davis leaned against the tractor. My father taught me mechanics in his garage in Detroit, said it was a trade no one could take away from me. He paused, then added, Your boy has the touch for it, natural talent. Johann has always been good with his hands, Friedrich acknowledged proudly. In another life, Perhaps he would have been an engineer. Still could be, Davis replied. War ends, life goes on, new beginnings. This simple exchange, bridging barriers of language, nationality, and experience, somehow provided Friedrich more comfort than any elaborate reassurances could have. Two fathers discussing their sons' futures, a fundamentally human moment amidst the chaos of history's tectonic shifts. As evening approached on what would be their final night in their ancestral home, the Weber family and the American soldiers shared an impromptu farewell dinner. Helene had used the last of their preserved stores, combined with American rations, to prepare a meal that felt almost celebratory, despite the circumstances. Captain Miller raised a cup of coffee in a simple toast. To new beginnings and safe journeys. After the meal, Friedrich once again took out his violin. One last time in this house, he said, positioning the instrument under his chin. The melody that filled the room was Bach's air on the G string, poignant, dignified, and deeply moving in its simple beauty. As Friedrich played, Wilson quietly captured the moment with his camera, preserving this final evening in the Weber home. When the music ended, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. Even Captain Miller, who had maintained professional detachment throughout their time together, blinked rapidly and cleared his throat several times. "Thank you," he said simply. As the evening wound down and preparations for the early morning departure continued, Margaret found herself helping Corporal Wilson pack his photographic equipment. "Will you continue taking photographs after the war?" she asked, carefully wrapping glass plates in cloth. "That's my plan," Wilson replied. "Though I don't know if newspapers back home will want pictures showing what really happened here." "What do you mean?" Wilson gestured around them. "This, Germans and Americans as people, not just enemies. Black soldiers being treated with respect. It doesn't fit the simple stories people want to believe." "Then they need to see it even more," Margaret said firmly. Wilson studied her face for a moment. "You know, in America, things aren't simple either. Being a Negro photographer, telling these stories, it won't be easy." "Is anything worthwhile ever easy?" she countered, holding his gaze. Something shifted between them in that moment, a recognition of shared purpose that transcended their different backgrounds. Wilson reached into his pack and withdrew a small notebook. "My parents' address in Philadelphia," he explained, writing it down and tearing out the page. "When you get settled in the American zone, if you wanted to write." Margaret took the paper carefully. "I would like that, to keep in touch, I mean." "Me too," Wilson replied simply. Elsewhere in the house, Lieutenant Robinson was helping Friedrich sort through papers and documents they would need for their journey. Birth certificates, identification papers, proof of Friedrich's teaching credentials, all would be important in establishing their status in the American zone. "What will happen to you when you return to America?" Friedrich asked as they worked. "Will you go back to teaching literature?" Robinson's smile was tinged with sadness. "That's my hope, though teaching positions for Negro professors aren't abundant, even with my qualifications." "That seems a waste of your talents," Friedrich observed. "Perhaps, but things are changing, slowly. The war has changed many of us, both those who fought and those who waited at home. We won't accept the old limitations so easily now." "Then we have that in common," Friedrich replied, "a determination to build something better from the ruins." Robinson extended his hand, and Friedrich clasped it firmly, two educated men recognizing in each other a shared commitment to the values of civilization that the war had threatened but not destroyed. Dawn broke on April 29th, with a pale, tentative light. The farmhouse was alive with activity from well before sunrise, final preparations, last-minute decisions about what could be carried and what must be left behind. Two military trucks waited outside, one for the Weber family and their belongings, the other for the American soldiers and their equipment. As the family took one last walk through their home, each room held memories that seemed to call to them. Emma broke down in tears in the kitchen, clinging to her mother. Johann stood in stoic silence in the room he had shared with his father's tools and mechanical projects. Margaret traced her fingers along the bookshelf, where her father's carefully preserved volumes of Goethe, Schiller, and Heine stood, too many to bring, yet impossible to leave without feeling a piece of themselves remained behind. Friedrich and Helene stood in the doorway of their bedroom, where they had shared whispers of resistance during the darkest days of the regime, where they had comforted each other through loss and hardship, where they had somehow maintained faith in humanity, despite everything they had witnessed. "We take the most important things with us," Friedrich said softly, taking his wife's hand. "Our children, our memories, our hope for the future." Helene nodded, blinking back tears. "And each other." The loading of the trucks was completed in solemn silence. Captain Miller checked his watch repeatedly, aware that Soviet advance units could arrive at any moment. Finally, everything was ready. "It's time," he announced. As the Weber family prepared to board the truck that would take them away from their home, Lieutenant Robinson approached with an official-looking document. "This is your transfer authorization," he explained. "It identifies you as anti-Nazi displaced persons under American protection. Keep it with you at all checkpoints." Friedrich accepted the paper with trembling hands. "How can we ever thank you, all of you, for what you've done for us?" "By remembering," Robinson replied, "by telling your story someday, when people are ready to hear it." Nearby, Sergeant Davis was giving Johann one final lesson, pressing a small toolkit into the boy's hands. "Basic tools," he explained through Robinson's translation. "Every mechanic needs his own set." Johann's face lit up as he carefully stowed the precious gift in his pack. Emma was receiving her own farewell gift from Private Jackson, a small book of American folk tales with simple illustrations that transcended the language barrier. "For when you're learning English," Jackson said with a smile. "My sisters loved these stories." As the family finally boarded the truck, Corporal Wilson approached Margaret with a small package wrapped in cloth. "What's this?" she asked, surprised. "Copies of some of the photographs," Wilson explained, "including the one of all of us together, so you don't forget." "I could never forget," Margaret assured him, clutching the package to her chest. With final handshakes and embraces, the farewells were completed. Captain Miller gave the order to move out, and the truck's engines roared to life. As they pulled away from the farmhouse, the Weber family crowded to the back of their truck, watching their home recede in the distance. Friedrich held his wife and younger children close, while Margaret sat slightly apart, her eyes locked with Corporal Wilson's until distance made him just a diminishing figure on the road behind them. The journey to Frankfurt took nearly 2 days, navigating roads clogged with military traffic, refugee columns, and the general chaos of a nation in collapse. At multiple checkpoints, the Webers presented the documentation provided by Lieutenant Robinson, receiving varying degrees of scrutiny, but ultimately being allowed to proceed under American military escort. They passed through landscapes of destruction that left them stunned. Towns reduced to rubble, bridges collapsed into rivers, fields scarred by artillery craters. The physical devastation mirrored the emotional and social devastation that 6 years of war had wrought on the continent. Yet amidst this bleakness, there were also signs of renewal. In some villages, people were already clearing rubble and rebuilding. Children played in the streets despite everything, their natural resilience a reminder that life continued even after unimaginable hardship. Their American escorts changed several times during the journey as they passed through different sectors, but the documentation arranged by Lieutenant Robinson ensured their continued safe passage. Each new group of American soldiers treated them with the same respect their original liberators had shown, a consistency that helped restore the Webers' faith in humanity after years of living under a regime that had systematically destroyed that faith. On May 1st, 1945, they reached Frankfurt, or what remained of it. Once a proud center of German culture and commerce, the city was now a landscape of devastation, with only 30% of its buildings still standing. The American occupation forces had established a processing center for displaced persons in what had once been a university building. As they approached the center, Friedrich turned to Captain Lewis, the officer who had escorted them on the final leg of their journey. "What happens to us now?" he asked through an interpreter. "You'll be processed and assigned temporary housing," Lewis explained. "Given your background as an educator with anti-Nazi credentials, you'll likely be prioritized for educational reconstruction roles. We need people like you to help rebuild a democratic Germany." The processing took several hours. Interviews, documentation review, medical examinations. The Weber family answered countless questions about their past, their political affiliations, their experiences during the Nazi era. Friedrich's history of resistance, modest though it had been, was noted with interest by the American officials. By evening, they had been assigned quarters in a partially damaged apartment building that had been requisitioned for displaced persons. The space was small, 2 rooms with minimal furnishings, but it was safe, and it was a beginning. As they settled in that first night, unpacking their few possessions in their new temporary home, Margaret carefully unwrapped the package Wilson had given her. Inside were a dozen photographs documenting their extraordinary encounter, the American soldiers working alongside her family on the farm, her father playing the violin for his unlikely audience, the group portrait of them all together on that last day. One photograph in particular caught her attention, a candid shot of her helping Wilson hang laundry, both of them laughing at some forgotten joke. The genuine joy captured in that moment stood in stark contrast to the gravity of their circumstances. Somehow, even amidst the collapse of one world and the uncertain birth of another, human connection had flourished. "May I see?" Friedrich asked, sitting beside his daughter. Margaret handed him the photographs, watching as he examined each one carefully. "Remarkable," he murmured. "Not just the images themselves, but what they represent." "What do you mean?" Friedrich held up the group portrait. "Look at us all together. German civilians and American soldiers, white and black, former enemies united in basic humanity. This is what they tried to destroy with their ideology of hate and separation, and they failed." Margaret nodded, understanding dawning. "That's why you wanted the photograph taken." "Yes. Someday, when all this is distant history, people might forget that even in the darkest times, individual humans can recognize themselves in each other, can act with decency and compassion across all the artificial barriers we create." He handed the photographs back to his daughter. "Keep these safe. They're evidence of something important." The following weeks brought rapid changes as Germany formally surrendered and the occupation zones were fully established. Friedrich, as Captain Lewis had predicted, was quickly recruited by the American authorities to help develop new educational curricula purged of Nazi ideology for schools reopening in the American zone. Johann, true to his mechanical inclinations, found an apprentice-like position, helping American mechanics maintain military vehicles, his skills flourishing under this practical education. Emma, always adaptable, made friends among the other displaced children and began learning English with remarkable speed. Helene, drawing on skills honed through years of making do with limited resources, became valuable in the community kitchen established to feed displaced families, her ability to create nourishing meals from sparse ingredients earning her respect among both Germans and Americans. And Margaret, with her quick intelligence and growing English proficiency, was soon working as an interpreter for the American Civilian Affairs Office, bridging the communication gap between occupation authorities and local German civilians. It was in this capacity, in late June 1945, that she had an unexpected encounter. Walking through the administrative building where she worked, she nearly collided with a soldier turning a corner. "Excuse me," she began automatically, then stopped, her eyes widening. "Lieutenant Robinson." Robinson's surprise matched her own. "Miss Weber, I hardly expected." He caught himself and smiled warmly. "It's good to see you. How is your family settling in?" Over coffee in the building's makeshift cafeteria, Margarete brought him up to date on her family's situation. Robinson listened attentively, clearly pleased by their relatively successful transition. "And you?" Margarete asked. "I thought you would be back in America by now." "Soon, I expect," Robinson replied. "Many of us are still here helping with the occupation administration. My language skills have proven useful." He hesitated before adding, "I ran into Wilson last week in Heidelberg. He asked about you." Margaret felt her cheeks warm slightly. "Oh? How is he?" "Well, still taking photographs when he can. He's been documenting the reconstruction efforts." Robinson studied her face for a moment before continuing. "He mentioned he gave you his parents' address. Have you written?" "I have," Margaret admitted, "but I don't know if the mail systems are reliable yet. They're improving. Military postal services can forward civilian mail now." Robinson smiled. I'm sure he'd be glad to hear from you directly." As their conversation continued, Robinson shared news of Sergeant Davis and Private Jackson as well, both still in Germany but expected to return to America within months. He also spoke candidly about the challenges that would await them there. "We're returning to a country that still doesn't recognize our full humanity," he explained. "After fighting fascism abroad, we'll continue fighting for our rights at home. Different battlefield, same principles." "Will it change?" Margaret asked. "After all you've done, surely America must recognize." Robinson's smile was both hopeful and realistic. "It will change because we will change it. Not overnight, not easily, but inevitably. What we've experienced here, the contradictions, the possibilities, we carry that knowledge home with us. We won't forget, and we won't let America forget either." 2 weeks later, Margaret received a letter forwarded through military channels. The return address was a military post in Heidelberg, but the handwriting was unmistakably Wilson's. "Dear Margaret," the letter began, "I hope this finds you and your family well in Frankfurt. Life here continues to be a strange mix of military routine and civilian reconstruction work. I'm still taking photographs when I can, trying to document not just the physical rebuilding, but the human stories behind it." The letter continued for several pages, mixing observations about occupation life with personal reflections and questions about her family's adjustment. The tone was warm but respectful, that of a friend reaching across divides of circumstance and background to maintain a meaningful connection. Margaret wrote back immediately, sharing her family's experiences and her own work as an interpreter. "Frankfurt is slowly coming back to life," she wrote. "Sometimes I walk through areas that were completely destroyed and find small shops opening in the ruins, children playing in cleared spaces. Life persists, just as you showed in your photographs." Over the following months, their correspondence continued, letters crossing as regularly as the chaotic post-war mail systems would allow. In November, Wilson wrote with significant news. "I've received my orders to return to America next month. Before I leave, I've been granted a week's leave. With your permission, I'd like to visit Frankfurt and see you and your family again." When Wilson arrived in Frankfurt in early December, the city had changed considerably from the devastation of May. Rubble still dominated many areas, but cleared streets, functioning services, and the resilient human activity of reconstruction had transformed the urban landscape. The Weber family, now settled in a proper apartment and increasingly integrated into the new social fabric emerging in the American zone, welcomed Wilson warmly. Friedrich had been promoted to an educational advisory position, helping reshape Germany's school system. Johann was formally apprenticed to an American-sponsored mechanical training program. Emma was thriving in her new school, already speaking English with remarkable fluency. "You all look well," Wilson observed, as they shared a modest but comfortable meal in their apartment. "Different from when I last saw you." "We are different," Friedrich acknowledged, "as is Germany, as is everything." Over the week of Wilson's visit, he and Margaret spent considerable time together, walking through the rebuilding city, talking about their experiences since last seeing each other, and carefully exploring the connection that had formed between them under such extraordinary circumstances. On his final evening before returning to his unit, they stood on a footbridge over the main river, watching the sunset reflect on the water between the broken spans of destroyed bridges. "I've been accepted to university when I return," Wilson told her, "under the GI Bill, photography and journalism." "That's wonderful," Margaret replied sincerely. "You'll finally be able to tell the stories you want to tell." Wilson nodded, then turned to face her directly. "One of the stories I want to tell is ours, how we met, what it meant, the bigger story it represents." "Our story? You mean my family and the American soldiers?" "That, yes, but also—" Wilson took a deep breath. "Margaret, I don't know what's possible in this crazy post-war world. There are so many barriers, so many practical obstacles, but I know what I feel for you is real and rare, and worth fighting for." Margaret felt her heart racing. "Marcus, are you saying—" "I'm saying I'd like to keep writing. I'm saying, maybe, when things settle, you might consider visiting America. Scholarships for German students will be established. I'm sure of it, I'm saying. He smiled ruefully. I'm saying I'm not ready for our story to end just because the war did. Margaret considered his words carefully, aware of all the practical difficulties such a relationship would face. Distance, cultural differences, social prejudices on both sides. Yet standing there on the bridge between destruction and renewal, anything seemed possible. Neither am I, she said finally, taking his hand. Ready for it to end, I mean. The future remained uncertain. Wilson would return to America within weeks. Margaret and her family would continue building their new lives in post-war Germany. The world was still fractured, still healing from wounds both visible and invisible. But in that moment, they affirmed a truth that their unexpected meeting had revealed, that human connection could transcend the artificial barriers of nationality, ideology, and prejudice. 2 months later, in February 1946, Margaret received a large envelope from America. Inside was a magazine, the Pittsburgh Courier, one of America's leading black newspapers. And there, featured prominently, was a photograph that made her gasp. It showed her father playing his violin in their farmhouse living room, African-American soldiers listening intently around him. The caption read, "Harmony amid chaos, German resistance family and Negro troops find common ground." Accompanying the photograph was Wilson's first published article, telling the story of the Weber family and their encounter with black American liberators. A story of unexpected connections across supposed divides. A small but significant testament to the possibility of human understanding, even in the aftermath of history's most devastating conflict. The final paragraph read, "As America and our allies work to rebuild a shattered Europe and construct a more just world order, we would do well to remember that our common humanity transcends all artificial divisions." In a small German farmhouse in April 1945, this truth was lived, not merely spoken. And in thousands of similar encounters across the continent, the seeds of true reconciliation were planted. Seeds that must be nurtured if we are to harvest a peace more meaningful than the mere absence of war. Margaret carefully folded the article and placed it with Wilson's letters and the photographs he had given her. Documentation of a moment when history's grand movements had intersected with personal lives, when supposed enemies had recognized each other as fellow humans, when love had emerged in the most unexpected of circumstances. Outside her window, Frankfurt continued its slow resurrection from the ashes of war. In America, Wilson pursued his education and his career in journalism, documenting the emerging civil rights movement while maintaining their correspondence across the Atlantic. The world was changing, painfully but inevitably, and their story, unusual, challenging, yet profoundly hopeful, was part of that change. In the summer of 1947, Margaret would indeed travel to America on a student exchange program, reuniting with Wilson and eventually completing her education there. Their path forward would not be easy. Both American and German society would present obstacles to their relationship, but the connection forged in those extraordinary days of April 1945 would prove more durable than the prejudices arrayed against it. And decades later, when their grandchildren would ask how they had met, they would tell a story that began with fear and ended with hope, a story about how love could flourish in the most unlikely soil, a story that contradicted everything that both their societies had believed about each other. The photograph of the German family and the black American soldiers, framed and prominently displayed in their home, would stand as testimony to a simple but profound truth, that in every generation, individual human hearts can transcend the artificial boundaries created to divide them, finding in each other the recognition that ultimately we are one human family, capable of both terrible destruction and remarkable healing. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.